So a while back, I took a family vacation up to Morro Bay, California, and I took one of my favorite shots of all time. So I just wanted to show you guys what my process was for editing this photo in Lightroom. Let's get into it. All right, so here we have the raw image straight out of camera. So my idea is, because there's so much foreground here, I want to crop it into a 1:1. So let's do that right now. But you know what? I think right about there it looks pretty good. All right, so we got the image crop. That's usually the first thing that I like to do. The next thing I like to do is I like to mess with the exposure. This particular image looks a little bright, so I'm going to bring it down a tad. I think that looks pretty good. The rock is mostly in shadow, so I want to bring up the exposure in the shadows a tad because I really want you to be able to see those details in the rock. So I think that looks pretty good. For those of you who don't know, you can hit the backslash button on your keyboard and it'll toggle between before and after views so you can see what kind of changes you've made thus far. Now, the next thing I'm looking at is that the image is looking much, much cooler than kind of my memory was telling me. This is probably actually true to life, but I remember it being kind of a warm sunset, so that's really what I want to convey in this image. So I'm gonna warm up the color temperature a bit. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now, I think I want to add a little bit of magenta to this image, just because I want it to feel a little bit more like golden hour, and sometimes the sunsets over there in the central coast of California can have a lot of pinks and purples, and I don't know, that's just kind of what I see in my head, I think. That's looking pretty good. Now, I think we need to add a little contrast here, so I'm going to go to my tone curve, and I'm just going to give a slight S curve to this. That is looking pretty good. So you can see here, I really want to accentuate these highlights around here because I want to make it look like the sun is kind of shooting through the mist from the ocean, and all of these little crevices and cracks in the rock, I really want to bring down those shadows to bring out the contrast, give it a little more depth. Now, typically what I do next is I'll go over to the HSL tab and adjust some of my individual color saturations. You typically want to do that after you do your tone curve or add contrast, because typically when you add contrast, you also up the saturation. So you don't want to do it twice. You know, you want to do your contrast first, and then you want to come over and start tweaking your colors a bit. So I do want to bring out more of the reds here. So let me just bring it up to taste. I think right around there looks pretty good. The oranges, for sure, we want to bump that up. I typically don't go too much past like 30 when I'm making adjustments. You'll start to get some weird artifacts if you go too far either way, positive or negative, on the saturation. There's some yellows here. You can see a lot of the yellows poking out in the spray of the ocean, so that's good. We want to make those look warmer. See the blues. A little spoiler alert, I'm not happy with this sky at all. It's super boring. There's not a single cloud in the sky. So I'm going to be doing a sky replacement later. I'll show you guys how to do that. For now, I'm just bumping up the blues just a bit because I know that there are some blues in the water. And in some of the shadows, I can see a little bit of the blues. So I'm just going to bump them up a bit. Now, the next thing I want to do is I really want to accentuate the surfer. I want to draw your eye in to the surfer. So what I'm going to do is add a radial gradient, and I'm going to darken everything around the surfer. So you can hit Shift M on your keyboard. And then if you want to draw a perfect circle, you can hold Shift while you drag your circle. And that will give you a perfect circle. So now I'm going to invert because I want to select the area other than the surfer. And I'm going to drop the exposure just a hair. Probably like that. Looks pretty good. So let's take a look. Before, after. Right away you can see we're doing a lot better here. A lot warmer. It's looking like sunset. More contrast, colors. Now I'm gonna have to get a little more advanced here with my selections because I think that the surfer is still a little darker than I would like. So what I'm gonna try to do is use Lightroom's object selection tool and see how good of a job it does. So what you do is you come up, you hit mask, create new mask, and if you go right here, you'll see objects. And what that does, it gives you this little brush, and what you can do then is pretty much just select the outline of the object you're trying to highlight. So let me go through this. I can tell right now that it's probably going to have a hard time with his feet. Probably some parts of the board. But the beauty is that we're not really zoomed in really close on the surfer. So if it doesn't do a perfect job, I think it'll be just fine. And it actually didn't do too bad. Well, actually, it did do a pretty bad job on the surfboard. You can see it didn't select the surfboard at all. So if that happens to you, you can come over here, you can click Add, get your brush out, and then you can just paint in your own mask. You can add to the I can't speak today. You can add to the object mask that you just created by brushing it in. So let me do that. I'll try to not take too long for you guys. Now, conversely, you can see that some things were selected that we don't want. So you can do the opposite of what we just did for the surfboard. You can subtract. Now, get your brush out, and we can subtract around the surfer here. Like I said, it doesn't need to be perfect because we're not zoomed in really close to this guy. All right, I think that's looking pretty good. Now all that work, and all I'm going to do is bump up his exposure a little bit. So I think like 1/3 of a stop is probably pretty good. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So before, after. It's really subtle, but it does make him pop, especially that highlight of sun on his back. I think it really pops a little bit more with that. Just that 1/3 of a stop more exposure on him. I think that works pretty well. Now, the next thing I want to do, I'm looking at the rocks, and there is so much detail there in the rocks, and I want to cheat a little bit, and I want to bring out those details even more. So I'm going to select the rocks just like I did with the surfer. I'm going to go to Object, increase my brush size a bit, And then I'm gonna come in and I'm going to draw around the edges of this rock. I don't think it's going to be able to get these really bright areas, which is fine. All right, let's see how good of a job it does. Not bad. That worked pretty well, actually. Now, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time doing, selecting a brush and getting every single spot of this because it's not that important, and you'll see why. Because all I'm going to do is add a little bit of texture to this. So I think you don't want to go too crazy with the texture because it becomes really obvious when you start doing this too much. So before, after. I really like to go the extra mile. What I want to concentrate on is really making this rock pop off the page, make it really 3D. So the way I like to do that is with a little old-fashioned dodging and burning. So I'm going to select my brush. I'm going to select all the highlighted parts that I want to make pop. And those are all of these little peaks here that are getting blasted by the sun. I really want those to pop out. And then I'm also going to select some of these shadows down here in the crevices and darken those up a bit. So let me do that right now. So shortcut, if you want to select your brush tool, you can just hit K and your brush tool pops up. All right, so I'm just gonna do this fast so I don't bore you guys to death, but you'll get the idea. So I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna select all of these really bright spots here, and we're gonna accentuate that sun hitting these points. I just realized for the first time ever that I think, are those people up there? Or are those birds? I don't know, maybe I'm tripping. All right, so that's what it looks like after I've made the selections. Now I just want to bump them up a tad. You don't want to overdo it. Right about there, looks pretty good. Just look how much they jump out. All right, now let's do the same thing, but let's do the shadows now. So we want to get, anything that's like a surface that would be in a shadow. So if you see like a ledge on the rock, whatever's under that ledge will probably be cast in shadow. So it's things like that that we really want to select here. So let me come in like this area right there. Some of these areas we can probably bump the brush tool size up right here, down here, right here. I know that this is very tedious and there might not be a lot of photographers that are willing to do this, but it could be something that sets your photos apart from everyone else. I'm not gonna go too crazy into this. I just want to show you guys an example of what I do. So let's bring these shadows down a bit. And we're just gonna do it a tad because it'll become really obvious if we do it too much. right there. You see that? You see how it just adds a little bit of depth? All right. I'm happy with that. That looks much better. So before, after. So I think a lot of people would just stop right here. Maybe because this looks good enough to you. Some people are really against sky replacements. I'm not one of those people. I don't really like it when people use just the stock skies that are in Photoshop or whatever photo editing software you're using. I always use pictures of skies that I've taken myself, so I know that they're unique. So let's go over and do that right now. So what you want to do, you want to come over to your image and you want to right click and you say edit in Adobe Photoshop. All right, so here we are in Photoshop. You can see that the image that you want to edit popped up automatically. Now we go to edit, sky replacement, and here's an image of a sky that I took outside of my house one day. The problem is that the sun in the picture that I took is on the opposite side of the sun in the picture of Morro Bay, of Morro Rock. So the first thing we got to do is flip that sun. And what I want to do is I want to increase the scale of this a bit, so that way I can have a little room to play around here. What I want to do is get that sun really low like it was that day. Like right about there. Because you can see it in the image right here, right where the rock and the water meet. You can see the sun was super low and it was really shining through the haze in the water. So when you're doing your sky replacement, make sure you honor the lighting of the scene. You know, you can't just put the sun anywhere you want. You have to think about the scene and pick a sky that corresponds to the lighting of your scene. Okay, so now I think we need to brighten up the sky a little bit because it's looking a little too harsh for this image. I'm gonna brighten this up a bit. I think 20 looks pretty good. The fade edge, it's pretty much how harsh is the cut in between your image and where the sky begins. So I like to give it a little bit more of a fade. It doesn't look so harsh that way. It looks a little more natural. And I want to warm up the sky a little bit. There we go. I think that works. Wow, look at that. It looks like a completely different picture. Once you have your sky replacement in here, what I like to do is I like to save it as a TIFF and bring it back into Lightroom, because a lot of times once you add the sky, the whole look and feel of the image changes a little bit, so you still may want to add some finishing touches. So let's go in here. We want to save as. I'm going to save it to my computer. Now, I don't mess with any of the naming. It automatically names it edit.tiff. And if you save it in the same directory that you were editing the original photo from in Lightroom, then you'll see that it saves. But then once we go over to Lightroom, you'll see that the image that we just created will automatically populate into Lightroom, which is a really nice feature. So you don't have to go hunting around for it. So right off the bat, bringing this image back into Lightroom, I can see that there are some finishing touches that I do want to make. For one, I think the entire image is looking a little dark, so I want to bump up that exposure just a tad. You can see my histogram pretty much right there in the middle. There's a lot of dark here due to this big shadow and the rock, of course, but overall, I'm sitting pretty well in the middle, so that's good. Okay, now looking at the image here, I want this reflection of the rock to be a little more apparent. So I'm gonna add a little bit of contrast, and at the same time, this sand here, I want it to have a little more warmth and color to it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a linear gradient from the bottom up. I'm not gonna go all the way to the top. I'll probably go to the surfer's head. So to add a linear gradient, you just hit M on your keyboard. And again, if you just wanna bring up a perfectly straight linear gradient, you hold Shift while you drag it up, and it will stay perfectly straight. So like I said, I wanna add a little bit of contrast to the area that I just selected. I think that is pretty good. Again, you don't want to overdo anything. So keep things, subtle. Subtlety is the key. It's looking a little dark down here. I want that to pop a little bit more just because it will also help the reflection pop too. If that sand at the bottom is a little brighter, then there's gonna be more contrast between the sand and the reflection. Okay, so I do want to bring out the color of the sand a little bit more, like I said, so I'm going to bump up the saturation a bit. I think that looks pretty good. And the last thing I want to do is, again, I want to add a tiny bit of texture to the sand just to bring this picture to life a little bit more. So the person viewing this they can feel the sand in their toes. It just helps that little extra bit. All right, I think that is looking pretty good. Like I was saying before, when you bring your new sky in, you're gonna notice that some things need to change. For instance, in this image, the original image, it was a bright, clear sky all the way across the entire photo. But now that we brought these clouds in there, it doesn't really make sense that the left side of the sand is just as bright as the right side because we have all these clouds over here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add another linear gradient to the bottom corner of the image so that way I can bring the exposure of that area down a bit. Probably gonna have to bring it down quite a bit. I think that looks a lot better. I think that makes a lot more sense. Now that I'm looking at this, I think we need a little more pop on the highlights of the rock. So I'm gonna go in there and do that again really quick. Pretty much just selecting the same parts that I selected before, just because I think it still needs a little something. I really want those to pop. I think that's good for now. We don't have to redo everything. I just want to make some of those really bright peaks pop a little bit more. So probably don't want to go up like a full third of a stop. Actually, I think right there, that's perfect. Now you can see that it really feels like the sun is hitting those edges really hard. Okay, so one thing I'm seeing here too, I think I mentioned it earlier, but it looks like there's a mist right here coming off of the ocean, and it's really beautiful the way that the sun is getting diffused through that light, and I really want to accentuate that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get my brush tool back out. I'm gonna enlarge it a bunch here, and I am just going to brush in some haze right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to dehaze, And I'm gonna dehaze that area just a bit, just to add a little more haze. And of course, I'm gonna warm that up a bit just so it looks a little bit more like golden hour. Perfect. One last thing that I think will really spice this up is if it looked like the surfer was getting hit by a ray of sun, by a ray of light. So there are a bunch of ways that you can do this. One of the quickest and dirtiest ways to do this is to get your brush tool out again. Now, I'm gonna start over here at the surfer, select a circle that's roughly the size of the surfer. Okay, you're gonna left click, but then what you want to do is you want to find where that light source would be coming from, and you want to put your cursor there, hold shift, and then left click again. And what that will do is it'll connect the two brush points together in a straight line. And that's a really quick and dirty way to get a ray of sun. And the only thing I'm going to do here is just bump the exposure up a little bit, just a tad. You got to be really careful with rays of sun because it becomes really obvious really fast that you photoshopped it. I think this is it. So really quick, let me show you. All right, this is before, raw, straight out of camera, and that's what we ended up with. That's a huge difference. I'm really happy with this picture. Like I said, it's one of my favorite images that I've ever taken. Actually, let's look at what we did since we brought it in from Photoshop back into Lightroom. So here's the before. This is straight out of Photoshop. Oh yeah. That extra haze that we added in front of the rock, that really sealed the deal right there. That is selling this picture so much more. Oh yeah, so much more. That was the winning ticket right there. All right. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. I'm sorry the video was a little longer than I expected, but I hope that you found it helpful and you got something out of it. Just a quick overview, or I guess some last minute tips, is be subtle with your changes. You know, do little increments at a time and flip back and forth between the original and your edited photo often, just to make sure you're not taking things too far. In terms of sky replacements, what I do is I bring my camera with me everywhere, and every time I see a beautiful sunset or an interesting sky, I snap a photo of it. And I keep a catalog, a whole folder full of all the different types of skies that I've shot, just for instances like this when I do need a sky replacement. So anyway, like I said, I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps me out a lot. If you want to see more of these types of tutorials for Photoshop or Lightroom, drop a comment down below and let me know. My name is Matt, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.